Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us for another CPHS webinar. This one a little bit off schedule on a Friday instead of our usual Thursday webinars. It's a Friday evening for many of you, so we thank you even more than we would usually be thanking you for spending your Friday evenings with us. Those of you who've come to these events before will surely know us, but for those of you who are here for the first time, my name is Kaushik Krishnan. I work at CMIE in the Household Survey Division, and it's my responsibility to make the record level data from the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey available to researchers across the world. I'm joined today by Mahesh Vyas. He is my senior colleague and the MD and CEO of CMI. Mahesh is also the person that invented CMI. He's the principal architect of CPHS, excuse me, not CMI. And nobody knows CPHS better than Mahesh. The two of us will take you through CPHS survey execution today. I will take you through a presentation that should last about an hour. If you have any questions while the presentation is going on, please ask them in the Q&A box. Mahesh will do his best to try and answer as many questions as possible. Once we're done, we have some time left over for live Q&A if we need to, and then we'll wrap up. Starting this October, we are changing our calendar. Many of you know this because you've received our emails, but we will be doing weekly events. Every Thursday, you will either be hearing from the two of us, Mahesh and I, or from an external speaker that's done some research using CPHS. This month itself, we are doing survey execution this week. Next week, we're going to talk about household groups in CPHS. The week after that is a very interesting topic. We're going to talk about age and gender in CPHS. It's the first time that we are going to tell you about the indicators that we actually collect and their distribution and what we learn from them. And then finally, on the last Thursday of this month, that's the 28th of October, we'll have Ashwini Deshpande, who's a professor at Ashoka University. Ashwini kicked off our CPHS research seminar series a year ago in October, and it's only fitting that we have her presenting her research again. This time it's co-authored with the PhD student Jitendra Singh, and the discussant for the paper will be Marianne Bertrand. So very, very interesting, exciting events this October. We have a similar lineup for November. Thank you for coming today. We hope to see you at future events. If you can't make them, you'll always get a recording of these events in your inbox after the fact. It's 6:35 p.m. India time, so we'll kick off the show now. Mahesh, are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Great. And are you still able to see it in full screen mode?
Yes.
Okay. So we'll get started. Today is all about survey execution in CPHS. Some of you might be here for the first time and don't know a lot about CPHS. So here's a very quick introduction. CPHS is an all-India household survey of a panel of sample households designed to capture fast frequency measures of well-being. When we say it's a fast frequency panel, we really mean it. We do 3 rounds of the survey every single year. We've been doing this since 2014, and we are in the last and final round of this year in 2021. That means we've completed 23 waves of data collection, and we are on the 24th wave of CPHS as we speak. The sample is very large. We have 178,677 households in our sample. As a panel survey, that makes us the world's largest household panel survey. When we say all India, we truly cover the length and breadth of India. CPHS has its presence in every part of India. If you sum up the entire part of India that CPHS has a presence in, that part of India contributes to 99% of India's total population. There are some small parts of India that we miss out. For example, some of the islands, certain parts of the Northeast that are hard to reach, Ladakh. But if you add all of them together, they account for 1% or less of India's total population. We capture many, many, many measures of well-being. We capture 635 indicators on these households and these individuals every time we interview them. But that's not the purpose of today's talk. If you'd like to know more about that, you can go to our YouTube channel. You'll see that we do regular webinars on what we capture in CPHS. I'd say one last point as an introduction to CPHS, which is that a lot of research has been done using CPHS data. There are 55 papers today that have been written using CPHS data. A lot of that is probably due to the fact that CPHS was uninterrupted through the lockdowns that India has experienced in the last 18 months, making it a very valuable source for research. However, as I just said, that's just an introduction to CPHS, but that's not what I want to talk to you about today. Today's agenda is just about how we run the survey execution. And to tell you about CPHS survey execution, there are just 3 numbers that you need to take away. One is the size of our team. We have roughly 300 people working inside CMI as CMI employees that run CPHS. Second, CPHS is conducted over a 4-month period, which can be broken down into 16-week slots. If you can understand how we do that breakup and how it's run through each of these week slots, you will understand the most important part of survey execution in CPHS. And finally, there is 0 paper in CPHS execution. From start to finish, the entire survey is digitally administered. I'll take you through each of these in the next 1 hour. Let's first start with the CPHS team. 298 people in total, approximately 100 people in supervision roles, and approximately 200 people who are our field team members or our interviewers on the field. Let's start by telling you about our supervisory staff. At the very top, we have survey managers. There are 5 survey managers that are located across the country, 1 of them in Mumbai, the other 4 in different parts of India, in Chandigarh, in Lucknow, in Kolkata, and in Kochi. The survey managers have very clear responsibilities. 1, they're in charge of hiring. 2, they're in charge of training. 3, they're in charge of survey execution. When it comes to hiring, survey managers are responsible for hiring their deputy survey managers or DSMs, and I'll tell you about what DSMs do in a minute. On top of that, survey managers are also responsible for the hiring of field information officers or FIOs. And if you see the grayed out text to the right of the screen, you'll notice that FIOs are also a part of the supervision structure. And you'll see more about why these people are important and why survey managers have this important job of hiring as DSMs and FIOs. Once they're hired, survey managers are also responsible for training. This happens by them, the survey managers, participating with us in the Mumbai head office to understand changes that take place to the survey from time to time. Those changes can be in terms of the questionnaire, they can be in terms of the apps or the technology infrastructure that we use to run the survey, they can be in terms of the logistics and how we actually manage these many people across India. And once they understand this and once they participate in the dialogue to make those changes, they convey those changes to the local teams. Now, this is critically important because that's how local teams know how to run the survey in the way in which we want it to be run. Finally, they play an important role in survey execution. Specifically, one of the biggest roles they play is in translating a very large survey instrument into regional languages so that it can be fielded across the country. Second, they are the most important people. Their primary responsibility is in creating the weekly execution plan for the survey. And we'll show you in just a few slides how that weekly execution plan is created and then followed in the field. Finally, they give feedback on survey performance back to Mumbai into the head office. Of course, we are getting feedback on survey performance through the data itself that's captured in the survey, through para data, which is data about data gathering and about the survey, through all kinds of other means. What survey managers help us do is they give us a bit more of a feel for what's actually happening. They give us very important stories from the field that go into our planning and our thinking about how to run the survey. Next, we have deputy survey managers or DSMs. We have 13 DSMs spread across the country. With the exception of Lucknow, where there are 2 DSMs situated, all the other regions have 1 DSM each. Those are Delhi, Agra, Kolkata, Bhubaneswar, Hyderabad, Nagpur, Indore, Ahmedabad, Bangalore, Madurai, and Srinagar. Now, the DSMs perform another set of tasks which are equally important. One, they monitor field information officers or FIOs. who you'll hear about in a second. 2, they ensure quality in the weekly plans that are executed in the field. 3, they're responsible for training of FIOs, who are the last layer of the supervisory staff, as well as our field team members or the interviewers that actually capture data and conduct interviews on the field. How do they monitor FIOs? Well, they are the chief custodians, the DSMs are the chief custodians of our survey standard operating procedure, or SOP. And it is their job to ensure that FIOs follow the SOP to the line. And when required, they suggest changes to the SOP back to central planning in Mumbai. When it comes to ensuring the quality of the weekly plans, DSMs do many important crucial functions. 1, they do surprise field visits in the field to make sure that interviews are going according to plan. 2, they do random callbacks after interviews are conducted to ensure that field interviews are going according to plan. Finally, they are involved in training of FIOs and FTMs. They do this through extensive field visits. DSMs are required to visit 2 towns every month, excluding the town that they are currently stationed in. When they do so, they meet, motivate, and train local teams, both FIOs and FTMs, on how to conduct the survey. Now that you know who the survey managers are, or the SMs are, and now that you know who the deputy survey managers, or the DSMs are, we'd like to tell you about field information officers, or FIOs. There are 78 FIOs spread across the country. Each FIO manages a team of about 3 to 5 FTMs, or field team members or interviewers. That's a great ratio. One field information officer, which is the lowest level line supervisor, manages no more than 5 interviewers on the ground. And each FIO is responsible for about 2,500 households spread across India, all clustered in a particular region. Now, FIOs have a very important set of responsibilities. 1, they're responsible for FTM management. FTMs, again, are field team members. They are the interviewers on the ground who actually conduct interviews. Second, FIOs are critically responsible for field relationship management. Third, and finally, FIOs perform a very, very vital function, which sets CPHS apart from many other household surveys, which is that they do real-time validation of every single record that's entered into the system in CPHS. When it comes to FTM management, FIOs do everything with FTMs. They're responsible for onboarding, for training, for guidance on survey execution. They're responsible for training FTMs on soft skills, on how to approach a household, on how to speak to different members of the household. They're responsible for helping FTMs in figuring out logistics. Then they're also responsible for field relationship management. And there are 2 critical kinds of relationships that FIOs need to manage. 1 is our relationships with our households. They are our ambassadors into the field. They talk to our households and they ensure that we as CPHS have a good relationship with each of the households in our sample. And this is critically important because we have a panel survey, which means that we want to visit these households 3 times a year, every single year, which makes these relationships all the more important. Equally, FIOs are also our local points of contact, managing relationships with local authorities. When you want to run a survey of this scale across India, it's important that you work with local authorities wherever it is that you're operating. FIOs are our bridge to local authorities across India. Finally, FIOs perform real-time validation of data that comes in to CPHS. They check every single interview in real time. They do random household callbacks, and we'll tell you a lot more about this validation process in just a couple of slides. Now, I finally want to move to one last group of supervisors who we call data guidance managers, or DGMs. There are 2 DGMs, but you'll see an asterisk next to this. That's because currently, both of those DGMs, due to our surveying during lockdown conditions, which I won't get into in this talk because we've done an entire webinar just on how we surveyed during the lockdown, these 2 DGMs were brought in to FIO roles to help FIOs, because often when we are conducting telephonic interviews in certain parts of the country, it's FIOs that conduct those telephonic interviews and not FTMs. To help in easing that load, DGMs were brought in. As we reach peacetime conditions again, these two DGMs, one stationed in Madurai, the other stationed in Srinagar, will go back to performing the role that they usually perform as data guidance managers. What do they usually perform? Well, they do two important things. They're regional experts, and their job is to provide post hoc feedback on survey execution. When we get to that feedback loop, I'll tell you more about how it works and the kinds of very, very interesting stories that our DGMs will often give us. With all of that being said, I want to focus now just a minute on our field team members or our FTMs. Again, these are our interviewers. These are our feet on the street. These are the people that work every single day without a break. Every single day, CPHS runs in the field. And we have 200 FTMs across India collecting data. On any given day, there are 200 approximately in the field. Their job is to conduct interviews. They are hired and trained by our FIOs, like I already said, on survey ethics, on how to build rapport with respondents and how to motivate them to participate in the survey, on administering the questionnaire, on operating our software, and on logistics. They're also trained on soft skills like communication. Every FTM that we hire has to pass an examination and must be certified by the survey manager, the single highest supervisory role in CPHS, before they can start field work. We take this process very seriously, and this tight control and process of training from the FTM level to the FIO, to the DSM, to the SM, with clear lines of communication all the way through, is what helps us execute such a mammoth survey across the country every single year. This, in a nutshell, is the team that runs CPHS. It's important to know about this team because now when I take you through how we conduct the survey across the 16 weeks of every single wave with zero paper, you'll understand how these people in different roles perform vital functions. Now that you've understood the team structure, let's move to the 16-week slots. They are the heart of CPHS survey execution in the field. So how do these 16-week slots work? Well, to understand that, you first need to understand what a wave of CPHS is. Many of you probably know this because you've attended our talks before, or you're using CPHS data and you're familiar with what a wave is. But for those of you who are joining us for the first time, let us quickly tell you what a wave of the survey is. We started the survey, as I said earlier, on the 1st of January in 2014, and we conducted 3 rounds of the survey in that year. From the 1st of January to the 30th of April, from the 1st of May to the 31st of August, and then from the 1st of September to the 31st of December. That cadence of 3 rounds of the survey without any interruption was maintained for every single year after that. In 2015, 2016, 2017, 18, 19, 20, through the lockdown, and in 2021. Today, we are sitting in wave 24, which is in the field. It started on the 1st of September of this year, and it will go on until the 31st of December this year. We just completed wave 23, and that was in May, June, July, and August of this year. So I'm going to show you, using wave 23, the wave that we just completed, how these 16-week slots work. The first thing to note before we can get to the weeks is the months. And CPHS manages to have continuous and even execution each month. Now, this isn't by accident. This is by meticulous planning. We'll show you what we mean by this. Let's take wave 23 as an example. There were 4 months in wave 23, May, June, July, and August. When you look at the sample that was slotted for execution in each of those 4 months, you'll see that the numbers are remarkably similar. 44,000 in some cases, in the 45,000 range, but equal distribution of households across these 4 months. In fact, it's not just monthly, it's weekly. So if you go week by week, there are 16 weeks in total in every single wave of CPHS. And in each of those weeks, you can see the numbers. These are the real, actual numbers of sample that was slotted to be executed in every single week of CPHS in the wave that just was finished. And if you look at these numbers, there's a remarkable similarity to them. They're between the late 10,000s and the early 11,000s. Now, this is critically important. And by the way, this balance is maintained at the level of states and it's maintained at the level of rural and urban. We'll talk about this in more detail, but first I want to tell you why that is. The reason is because we want to capture all the variation that takes place across India. If survey execution is lumped into certain parts of the year, in certain months when it's convenient to go into the field, when there may be a harvest season or no harvest season, or a holiday or no holiday, or rains or no rains, that might work well for the producer of the data, but it doesn't work well for many of you, the researchers and the consumers of the data. For that reason, we make sure that there is an even cadence when it comes to CPHS execution every single month every single week of every single month of every single wave of CPHS. Now, as I mentioned, this entire plan is created before the wave begins. We start with last wave's week slots. Every wave has 16 week slots. If you want to know what they are, they're in our documentation. You can find all of our documentation at consumerpyramidsdx.cmi.com. You should be able to see the URL on the bottom of most of the slides on this talk. We take last wave's week slots and we don't change a thing. Households don't change week slots across waves. Again, it's for the same reason as I just described. We want consistency in the way in which households are interviewed. It doesn't work if we interview one household, the same household, in wave one, in week one of a particular wave, and then in week 16 of another wave. We need to make sure that they're always planned to be interviewed 16 weeks apart. If there are new households for the wave, those new households are assigned month and week slots. If there are households that are dropped, they're removed from their month and week slots. And then finally, once all of this adding and deletion is done, for each state, the 16-week slots are tweaked to ensure that the rural and the urban households are distributed equally across those 16 weeks. This ensures that the rural and urban sample at the level of each state is equally distributed over the 16 weeks of a wave. And I just told you why that is so critically important to data collection. It imposes heavy costs on us, which we bear. And sometimes it means not getting responses, because if you can't get a response within the narrow window that a household is allocated to be surveyed, it often goes uninterviewed in a particular wave. But we take that cost because we believe that the consistency in data collection is much more important. If you want to know what the rural and urban split looks like, here it is. Again, you will see the remarkable consistency in the rural numbers week by week across India, and the similar consistency in urban numbers week by week across India. Now, let's move to some of the rules about how these week slots are implemented in reality. The most important rule is that there can never be any spillover at the end of a wave. What I mean by that is, if a household does not get interviewed when it is supposed to get interviewed, it cannot spill over into the next wave. When a wave ends, it's a hard stop. Any household that wasn't interviewed will not get interviewed as far as that wave is concerned, because when we move on one day from one wave to the next, everything changes. There's a complete reset. Oftentimes, there might be a new survey instrument. There might also be a new sample. So there is no spillover at all at the end of a wave. In fact, we don't even allow spillovers at the end of a month. If a household cannot be executed in the month that it's allocated to be executed, a household almost always goes unsurveyed. We say almost always because there were some exceptions that were made, especially in the last 18 months on account of the lockdowns. Now, finally, let's go into each of these week slots, these 16-week slots. We do permit some small spillover between these week slots. If a household cannot be surveyed, for example, in week 11, it may get surveyed in week 12. Now, how does this entire thing happen? Well, that happens with the weekly plan. So the weekly slots Every one of these 16 slots, they're all determined before the wave begins. Before we even go into the field, the entire planning is done and weekly slots are created with households inside them. Then our survey managers, the highest level of supervisors in the CPHS supervisory structure, the SMs, they take those weekly slots, they turn them into very detailed plans for the week. A weekly plan is created and frozen at most the day before the weekly slot begins. So if we are going into week 11, which is the third week of July, one day before week slot 11 begins, the survey manager should have taken the week slot information for week 11, done all the meticulous planning that they would need to do to make sure that the survey can actually be conducted in their region, and they freeze that weekly plan at most the day before that slot begins. These plans are very precise. They include information about how every single household in that survey manager's region for that week slot will be surveyed, exactly when they will be surveyed, and by whom, by which interviewer. That's the level of detail that goes into these weekly plans. And by construction, we allow survey managers flexibility in those weekly plans. They can change those weekly plans up to one day before that slot begins. Now, we have to allow them to do that because they need to accommodate for local events, for example, internet shutdowns, disruptions, for example, some transport shutdowns, weather, all kinds of other local disruptions that might take place. Now, when they're doing all of this, they need to be careful in not overloading our FTMs or interviewers. FTMs can never be assigned more than 7 households to interview in a day. Usually, they're assigned 6 households to be interviewed in a given day. And when these plans are made, no interviewer can ever be assigned the same household in 2 successive waves. This is to ensure that, as you can imagine, if the same interviewer keeps interviewing the same household, you might start losing track. If an interviewer might start going off script and might start answering questions on behalf of the household simply because they interview that household so often. So no interviewer can ever be assigned the same household in 2 successive waves. And the weekly plan that each of these survey managers prepare, they have to be signed off with the explicit concurrence of the FTM that's going to do the interviews in the field. So these weekly plans are incredibly detailed documents that are frozen in advance that ensure that we know before we go into the week which household is going to be interviewed on which day by whom. Now that you understand our team and these weekly slots, we can show you how a survey actually takes place in the field. And the critical thing to note when we're showing you this is that there is 0 paper that is used in the survey in conducting any interview in the field. Let's start with the interviewer or the FTM. You can see in gray on the left-hand side of your screens that there's a little note there saying interviewer and FTM. And let's imagine this interviewer FTM going to a particular household on some day T. Their job as far as that household is concerned actually begins one day before that, on day T-1. So on day T-1, the interviewer is allowed to download an interview form. Now, some of you might be saying, what's all this downloading business? And that's where the 0 paper comes in. There are no physical interview forms. Everything is done on a handheld app that every single interviewer has. And they use that app for data collection. And they can download forms for every single interview into that app. Each household in the sample has a unique blank interview form associated for that household in every single wave. And each of those forms is pre-filled with some basic information on the identity of the household to help the interviewer reach the household and to verify that this is in fact the household that needs to be interviewed. And these forms are only available for download at most one day before the data collection can begin. So 2 days before the data collection can begin, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, 1 week, 6 weeks, 16 weeks before, the interviewer cannot download those forms. They can only download an interview form 1 day before the interview is scheduled to begin. We allow that 1 day because of the reality that sometimes interviewers go into the field and conduct an interview in a part of India where there may not be data availability. So they have to be able to work offline. Once they download that interview form, which they can do at most 1 day before the interview, they show up at the household to actually conduct the interview. When they show up at the household, the first thing they do is they sign in for that particular interview. When that happens, their GPS information is immediately logged and stored. Then they start conducting the interview. As soon as the interview is done, they sign out. Again, their GPS information is logged and stored. And all of this information, the form, the GPS information, a lot of other data, it's all sent from that interviewer's device on their app to CMI's servers in Mumbai. As soon as that is done, that particular record is locked on the interviewer's device. The interviewer can then not go back and change a single thing on the record from the interview of that particular household. Now, our surveyors step in, our supervisors step in, or our field information officers or FIOs. That same data that an interviewer captured and signed out and beamed to the CMI servers, that data now gets beamed back into another app, which is the FIO app or the supervisor app. The supervisor has a separate app. That information gets beamed into that app. And then the supervisor can see exactly how a given interview took place. And if they see something amiss, if they have questions, they can enter remarks against any entry that was made during data collection at that household. They cannot edit entries. They only have read permissions. They can read everything that the interviewer has done, and then they can enter remarks against a given entry, but they cannot change a single thing. Now, what's really important about this is that this entire procedure from interview to sending the data to our servers, and then that data getting sent back to an FIO for checking, that entire process cannot take more than 1 day after the survey. In almost every single case, this happens on the same day as the interview took place, often just within minutes or hours of that interview having been completed. So this is really, truly real-time data validation. In real time, there is an FIO sitting with an app that they look at to see every single interview, look through every single data field of that record and make their notings in real time. And when they make their notings, they can take a couple of decisions on what to do with that particular interview. One is that they can choose to accept that interview. They look through the entire interview and they say, okay, everything went according to plan. There doesn't seem to be any problems with this record. I accept this record. At that point, the form, both on the FIO's app as well as on the interviewer's app, are immediately deleted. This way, we protect the privacy of the household. The data is stored on the interviewer's device or the FIO's device only as long as absolutely necessary. And as soon as the data is accepted, that data is wiped from the interviewer's device as well as the supervisor's device. And that data is written into our central server permanently. It is locked and cannot be touched again. Now, this is a very important point in our entire survey execution procedure. There is no post hoc touching of the data. Nobody, not a field information officer, not anybody sitting in the head office in CMI in Mumbai, can touch any data once it's been accepted. Acceptance is not the only thing, though, that an FIO can do. An FIO can also reject a record and say, the quality of this record is too poor, it cannot be accepted into the system. If the FIO rejects a record, then that household is replanned and assigned to a brand new interviewer because the FIO has rejected completely and outright what the previous interview had done. And then it can take up to many days after the household was originally slotted for execution to be replanned and then redone, as long as it's done within the wave. If it can't be done within the wave, the household is effectively unsurveyed for that wave. Another thing that the FIO can do instead of rejecting it is to say, it isn't a rejection outright, but why don't we just resurvey that particular household? That means that the record is still bad quality, but it's not so bad that it cannot be redone by the same interviewer. In that case, it's replanned, but it's assigned back to that same interviewer to go back to the household and redo the survey. And then finally, there's one more thing that an FIO can do, and this is the most common action that our FIOs take, which is instead of rejecting outright or resurveying the household in total, is to simply recheck that record. What we mean by that is that the form again becomes available to the interviewer with the comments from the supervisor. And reading those comments, the interviewer can either check those fields with that particular household, just those individual fields where an FIO has made a comment, or can explain why he or she has this particular entry and why the FIO's comment or concern perhaps is not warranted. Now remember, all of this is happening in real time. An interviewer goes to a household, starts an interview, completes an interview, the data is sent to our servers in Mumbai, it's then sent to our field information officers. They look at the data in real time. They say, well, perhaps this income item doesn't look right, or perhaps this expense on fruits and vegetables doesn't look right, or perhaps this information on debt doesn't look right. They make notings and they say, interviewer, can you recheck these particular values? The interviewer probably hasn't gone more than a couple of kilometers, because remember, the interviewer only has 6 to 7 households, almost always in the same region, the same village or the same block or the same town to interview, and then sees this feedback coming in. If the interviewer can immediately answer the questions, the interviewer writes exactly why it is that the interviewer wrote these points down, or goes back to the household because they're not so far away from the household to begin with, collects the data as they need to, and then re-upload the record. The beauty of the system is the fact that this entire thing is electronically controlled, which allows us to do this with very little gaps in terms of data collection, eyes, a pair of eyes looking at the data, comments, feedback, and then making any checks if they need to be made. If the FIO is satisfied after the entire process of a recheck, but equally a resurvey or a reject, then they can choose to accept the record. So let's now imagine that we've gone through this process, an interview happened, it was either accepted immediately or it was rejected and then resurveyed and then finally accepted or rejected again, or rejected outright, or just a recheck. Eventually, a household record is either accepted or it's not. Now, let's take these accepted records and see what happens next. Once these records are accepted, there are still feedback loops that operate on a much larger time cycle than this immediate same day or T+1 time cycle. And they feed back into our survey process continuously. And they happen primarily through 2 different ways. One of them is something that I already showed you, which was what our data guidance managers or DGMs do. Data guidance managers are local experts. The DGM team studies data as it's collected, often from previous waves, and locates specific areas for improvement. They study the data according to regions because they're experts in understanding those regions. And they study it mostly to understand item level non-response. Why is it that particular items or questions in CPHS seem to have elevated rates of non-response in specific geographies that they study. And through that study, they give this information back to the survey managers, to the deputy survey managers, and to the field information officers. And this can often be used to sensitize our field team members or our interviewers to ensure that better interviews take place. I'll give you one example. It's my favorite example, and it was an example that was given to me by Mahesh just before I joined CMI, and I thought it was such a powerful example of how this DGM process works. This is pre-lockdown, when movie theaters were open and when movies played. And one of our DGMs in the south of India was acutely aware of the fact that there is a Rajinikanth movie that has just been released. And that means that when we are capturing consumption expenditure information, especially about outdoor entertainment, such as going to the movies, we should be careful and we should guide our field team interviewers to know that there is a Rajinikanth movie. And that might mean that a certain quantity of expenses, which is usually quite low, might be elevated this month or this wave. That kind of local intelligence, no matter how much algorithmic data processing we do, is still incredibly vital. And the DGMs perform this kind of role. They are region experts. They understand the culture of the region, and they use their knowledge of that region to make sense of the data as it's coming in. And they feed that information back into our entire supervisory mechanism, and they sensitize our interviewers to make sure that interviews are really, really high quality. Now, on top of this layer, which is a human layer of feedback that goes back in, there is also another layer, an automatic layer that is done through the analysis of paradata. Paradata is data about the survey that's collected during the survey. I'll give you a couple of examples of what I mean. It's interviewer specific, and it's about, for example, the amount of time an interviewer takes from start to finish of the entire interview. But it's also the amount of time an interviewer takes for every single question. And remember, we ask every single question afresh in CPHS. So we ask age each time. We ask gender each time. We also ask employment status each time. And we also ask income each time. And so when we capture the time it's taken to capture gender or age, that might be okay to take just a second or 2 seconds. But when you capture something like, say, expenditure on kitchen appliances, maybe that should take slightly more. So all of this information that we have on the time it takes for the interviewer, not just to complete the entire form, but every single data entry point in the form is studied and used automatically by our systems to understand whether our interviewers are doing a good job. Similarly, we study the important relationship between an interviewer and the household that they're interviewing. How do male interviewers perform with male respondents? How do male interviewers perform with female respondents? How might female interviewers perform with male or female respondents? How might interviewers of one religious group perform with households of another religion or another caste or another income group? All of these vital relationships in how interviews might change subtly on the margins. When the interviewer and the household change, we study all of that, automated, and it's pumped back into our system. This is information that's given to the top level supervisors, and they use that to understand how specific interviewers, every single of those 200 interviewers that are in the field, how are they performing? Where are they consistently doing something that might be wrong? Where can they be told that they can do something better? And all of this information is fed back to them. And the paradata is used, it's analyzed to isolate peculiar behaviors in data collection. And if need be, it can result in interventions in training, or in some cases, even penalties for very, very outlier behavior when it comes to how data is being captured. Now, all of these feedback loops operate on a much larger cycle. There are small feedback loops that operate in real time. That's when the interviewer is getting direct feedback from their FIOs. And then there are these larger cycles that are done through Paradata analysis, through our data guidance team, through conversations happening between the interviewers, the FIOs, the DSMs, the SMs, the central team in Mumbai. And slowly, all of that information is brought to bear in honing the quality of survey execution every single day that the survey runs. This gives you some idea of what we mean when we say that there is zero paper in CPHS's survey execution. And these three numbers, 298 CMI employees in the survey team, 16 week slots, and zero paper should help you take away some stories about how CPHS is executed. Firstly, it is executed with a very large in-house team. None of this is outsourced to any third-party staff. And this team consists of almost 100 supervisors and almost 200 interviewers. And at the very bottom, the line supervisor, the person closest to an interviewer, is only supervising 3 to 5 interviewers in the field at any point in time. That's how they are able to perform their functions that they perform when survey execution actually happens. With 16 week slots, the important thing to remember is how we break up the wave well before a wave starts. Decisions are taken not in an ad hoc manner, not in real time, but they are planned well before the survey begins. Every household is given a weekly slot when the household will be surveyed. And that weekly slot does not change. That household is surveyed again 16 households, 16 weeks later, unless there are some small disturbances. Once a household is allocated to be surveyed in a particular week slot, it can't move into the next month, and it can certainly never move into the next wave. There can be changes that happen to our weekly plans. Those are changes that are signed off by our survey managers, and they must be signed off a day before the week starts. And the entire plan is designed in a way to make sure that our interviewers are not overloaded in terms of number of interviews, and that they are planned in concurrence with the interviewers that are actually going to go into the field to conduct the interviews. And after all of this planning, once they go into the field, the entire system is electronic. This allows us to collect a lot of data on how the interviews are actually being conducted in the field. It also allows us to minimize data leakage at any point. We really value the privacy of the households that participate in our survey. So there is no data that can just linger on a device, whether it's an interviewer's device or a supervisor's device. And importantly, the only person that can ever make changes to a record is the interviewer themselves. And the changes can only happen through our system. It's only when a supervisor says, I think something's wrong here, that an interviewer, depending on the situation, can make changes to a particular record in the whole, or just a single data entry column or row or field somewhere to make sure that the data is okay. Other than that, there is nobody else that can ever touch the data that's collected in CPHS. FIOs, line supervisors, can only comment. And then beyond that, they only have the decision to accept data or not. Once that data is accepted, it is locked forever. There is no post hoc touching of the data by anybody in the CMI team. And these three numbers should stand out to you as the pillars of what make our survey execution so robust. It's possible that many of you have questions about how we executed the survey during the lockdown. We've answered those questions before in previous webinars. But today, well, we have an eye to the future. We've completed September with almost 99, not almost, more than 99% of accepted interviews being conducted in person. We are starting to see the possibility that we're going to go back to peacetime survey operations. And so the purpose of today's talk was to take you through what that future is going to look like. And we hope that this has been an important useful, informative glimpse into how we execute CPHS during peacetime. So thank you very much for your time, for your attention. I'm sure there have been lots of questions in the Q&A box, but I can't see them yet. My name is Kaushik Krishnan. My email address is kkrishnan@cmi.com. If you've been asking questions, those questions are being patiently answered by Mahesh Vyas. Mahesh is mahesh@cmi.com. We thank all of you for coming to our events. We hope that you'll come to more events in the future. If you're on Twitter, please follow us. We are @_CPHS. If you want to know more about CPHS, please go to our website, consumerpyramidsdx.cmi.com. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and hand it over to Mahesh to comment on the questions that perhaps you've been seeing, Mahesh, in the last hour or so.
Thanks, Kaushik, for a wonderful presentation. There haven't been any questions this time. It's been an extraordinarily quiet session so far. I think everyone was paying rapt attention to what you were saying, because execution is such an interesting topic. The execution done by us is very different from that done by others. It is perhaps the only survey that is conducted such that there is 100% checking of the data in real time. So two important things: A, 100% checking of the data; B, in real time. So that's really a very interesting thing, and you brought out that very well. The balanced nature of the panel and the execution throughout the 16 weeks of execution, and the fact that all this is with no paper. In fact, if there were to be paper, we wouldn't be able to do these things in real time. So they all kind of work together. No paper, real time, 100% 100% validation, and so on and so forth. They all go in well together. So I think this has been a very illuminating presentation by you, Kaushik. I'm sure all the people on the show have benefited tremendously from it. Since there are no questions, we could take the liberty of bringing this show to an end. Up to you, Kaushik.
Absolutely, Mahesh. I couldn't agree with you more. Thanks for summing up what's happened today. It's a Friday evening for most of the people here. We can understand that they have probably other places to go. So we just like to thank everybody. Many of you are people who have come to previous webinars before. Mahesh, you'd like to say something?
No, there's one question that has come up from Amol Shaila Suresh.
Okay.
So is there any re-verification of data by FIO, like say random visits or calls to household? Would you like to answer that, Kaushik? You did mention about this in your presentation, that there are surprise visits by the FIOs, and there is a check on what they're doing also by the DSMs, but it's not a part of the process where the data collected by the FTM is necessarily checked by the FIO. The DSM does a supervision to ensure that the FIO is doing her work efficiently. Then there are checks which are done only at the para data level. There is no other check of what the FIO is doing. I hope I've answered your question, Amol, adequately.
That's great, Mahesh. That's a very complete answer to this. Amol, thank you for your question. Perhaps I was a bit too hasty in moving to end the session. If anybody has any other questions they'd like to have answered, please feel free to type them into the Q&A box, and we will try to answer them. We can give you all another minute, but we won't hold it against you if you don't have any more questions. We'll assume that we've answered all of your questions. And like I was saying, it's a Friday night, and so perhaps you have other plans, maybe a little more exciting than learning about CPHS survey execution. Mahesh, I think that's it. I don't think we are expecting any more questions. So thank you for giving us your time on a Friday evening as well. This website, this video will be available on YouTube. So we'll make sure that all of our attendees get a link to it, as well as the people that signed up and weren't able to attend. And we hope to keep doing this and keep building a community and a dialogue with our research community on how we conduct the survey, in getting as transparent as we can and being able to provide value to the people that finally use our data. So thanks again, Mahesh. Any closing words? And I leave it to you to say thanks and bring the session to an end.
No, I think thank you very much, Kaushik, for giving this presentation, and thank you for everyone who was there on the show. We have all benefited from the presentation and look forward to more presentations in the coming weeks.